All right, I'll say it again. What did we learn last week? Stuff.
Personal study habits.
Personal study habits, right? We talked a little bit about the history of the Bible. We're gonna cover that again. And even though we haven't really talked about study habits as of yet, I wanted to start by going through the history of the Bible because of this primary question and concept. Like, do you understand how lucky you are to own a personal copy of the Bible? Because never before in the history of mankind has God's Word been so accessible. But accessibility, I was thinking about this today. Accessibility, first of all, doesn't mean engagement and understanding. Does that make sense? Like someone can have their house littered with print and electronic Bibles but never pick it up. It doesn't do them any good. It's not like it gets in through osmosis. I remember sleeping with my algebra book. Actually, it was my high school geometry book underneath my pillow, literally the night before a test, thinking it's just going to sink in there somehow. Right? It doesn't work that way. And I was thinking about historically, most of the history of man, people did not have access to the scriptures the way that we do. And I believe there's pros and cons to that. One of the pros being, I think it engendered a respect and reverence for God's Word. However, it meant that individuals were reliant on someone else to read it to them, to interpret it, to tell them what it means. And of course, that can be abused, and I think historically in Christianity that has been. Not just by the Roman Catholic Church, by all the Protestant Reformation denominations as well. And on the other hand, if we go the opposite direction and talk about our time, where literally you can pick up your phone, get online, or pull out one of maybe a couple of different Bible translations you have at home, it's immediately accessible. But I think sometimes that immediate accessibility, that ease of access, might decrease our respect and our reverence. Do you guys agree or disagree with that? Go ahead.
I agree.
Just thinking that it heightens our responsibility.
Yeah, I think it really does. Now, I said this to Kathy last week. I think that, have you guys ever seen videos of, I've seen this of videos in like Messianic synagogues where they have a copy of the Torah, and it's a big fancy scroll and it probably cost a lot of money, and they parade it down the aisle and people are reaching out to touch it. What do you guys think about that?
I've been there. That's where Terry goes. Terry, when I see that, I immediately went, that's idol worship. To me, it's at a point to where they get these parchments and they're like, oh, they're getting their Bible and touching it, or they're kissing it. And I think about the Pope being former Catholic, how they kiss his ring, and a lot of religious nonsense.
Back in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, it was not uncommon for the church to have relics that they believed were imbued with some kind of supernatural power. Right? And I don't say, I completely agree with you. I think that is going a step too far. I think it goes from reverence to idolatry.
Yes.
Right? And it kind of feels funky to me to talk about it that way because it is God's Word.
Right.
But when you reach out to touch something because you think it's, kind of like Jesus walking through the crowd and someone touched the hem of his garment and power flowed out from him and he said, "Who touched me?" Right? It's not, I don't care who printed the Bible or how beautiful it looks or what source material it came from. Touching it is not going to do anything for you. But reading it and understanding it and studying it and disciplining yourself will. So in that sense, the Bibles that I have accessible here are just as powerful as any printed Bible, no matter who holds it or whether they parade it up and down an aisle in a church or a synagogue.
I kind of disagree.
Okay.
Just my own personal opinion. I love books of any form. Joe will tell you there are times in past that I would sit in church and I would just run my fingers over the words in the Bible. Just because it means a lot to me.
But you're not expecting something supernatural or to have a blessing.
No, it's just my love of that printed word.
Right.
And so if I were in this situation with the Messianic Jews, and it depends on how long ago you're talking about they do that, whether it's now or whether
They still
it's.
do it now.
Oh, okay, well, I was kind of thinking like 1,000 years ago or
No,
whatever.
that's like-
It's
Yeah,
still
they still
now.
do.
Like tonight, right now,
Yeah,
with the Messianic
because I
symbol.
can understand how if you didn't have a copy in the Bible and that was the Torah was the only thing you had, I would want to touch it.
Yeah, but that's different than touching it, expecting something supernatural
Oh,
to
I don't
happen.
expect that.
Now,
Just
take
because
me
it's
take
that.
me to the museum where the Isaiah scroll is,
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah,
open
the candy
the
store.
cabinet and let me sniff it. I mean, because I'm like, okay, this is like from 125 BC. I mean, yeah, there's something special about it in that sense, but it's no different than the Isaiah that's right here. Isaiah's Isaiah. I have a copy of it. In fact, I have multiple copies in different translations. I understand what you're saying. I'm saying beyond that, where the expectation is there's something imbued in the object itself.
And more
Sorry,
formal.
let me go back because Ebony had her hand up earlier.
Yeah, I was actually kind of just thinking along the same lines as Judy here, but I think I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing. And who's to say that these people who are touching the Torah as it goes by has the same mentality as Judy, or for yourself, like if you saw the Isaiah scrolls, it was just like, oh my gosh, because it is. I mean, I've attended a Messianic church before, and it is kind of, I guess there's a neat factor of like, wow, this is an actual ancient scroll that was written in Hebrew, like it's kind of a little fascinating in that.
It is, and I don't disagree. And really, the reason why I'm bringing this up is in the age of accessibility that we have, how do we increase our reverence for the scriptures? Because remember, we're going to be talking about personal study habits, and I think one of the most profound things that we can do to set the stage for that is truly appreciate what we have. Right? So what I want to do is very quickly go through some of the things that we had talked about last week. But actually, before I do that, I'm going to have Kyle, why don't you go ahead and read. I had asked Kyle to try to come up with a couple of stories, and he sent me one that he thought was particularly intriguing, just about other people who don't have the privileges that we have. Go ahead.
So basically the context is, it's this book called Torture for Christ. It's during the communist reign, basically, whenever they were dominating Romania, Russia, China, and stuff like that. And in order for, let me just read the stupid thing. The underground church knows how to use atheistic literature to feeding upon it, just as Elijah fed by ravens. The atheists put much skill and zeal into ridiculing and criticizing Bible verses. They published books called the Comical Bible and the Bible for Believers and Unbelievers. They tried to show how stupid scripture is, and to do so quoted many Bible verses, how we rejoiced over it. The book was printed in millions of copies and was full of Bible verses which were unspeakably beautiful even when the communists ridiculed them. The criticism itself was so stupid that no one took it seriously. In the past, heretics burned by the Inquisitions were taken to the stake in a procession, depressed in all kinds of ridiculous clothes with hell flames and devils painted on them. And what saints were these heretics? In a similar way, Bible verses remain true even if the devil quotes them. The communist publishing house was very glad to receive thousands of letters asking for reprints of these atheist books that quoted Bible verses to mock them. They did not know that these letters came from the underground church, which had no other opportunity of receiving the scriptures.
Oh, wow.
Not wild, right?
Yeah.
And Kathy, you've told me a story before. I don't know if you can recount it again, of the lady, I think it was an underground church in China.
No,
Or
it
was-
was Russia.
Was it Russian?
And they were having a, because this is how I feel too, Judy. They were having this Bible study, I know you do as well. And I guess the communist guards came in and this young girl, teenager, had a Bible in her hand, and they said, spit on it and we'll let you go. And she, with tears going down her face, kissed her Bible, and they shot her and killed her. But she was just like, I'll never do that, how I feel. I just want to kiss it, you know. But not because of it's an idol, but because I just
Because of the value
We
of the
all feel-
contents.
we all feel
We
that
all
way.
feel the
Yeah.
same way.
Yeah, we all feel
But
that.
does Lavanya have that problem
What do you mean?
with not being able to have the Bible?
Oh, when she's back in India, yeah, she basically has to hide the fact that she's a
Yes.
Christian.
She can't have the Bible
Yeah.
with her.
No.
Yeah. You know, up until somewhere around the 16th century or so, people just didn't own Bibles. And even like Catholic priests and Reformed ministers had to share the parish Bible, right? There was only so many that went around, but of course, you know, the invention of the printing press back in the 1400s, and then subsequent printing of Bibles over the next 100 years or so, it really changed things because it reduced the cost. You know, I think I mentioned last time, for someone to buy a Bible, you had, prior to the printing press, you had to hire a scribe. And imagine how long it took to actually hand copy the Bible. And so you had to pay him for the materials and all the work, and that took a long time. And it, you know, it equated to, I think, about the price of a house today, like, you know, a year's salary, something like that. So the printing press reduced the cost. It allowed for widespread distribution, and it allowed for translation into the common language. But you know, it wasn't until the 1980s that the Bible became available in things like Bible software. You guys, you know those handhelds, like back in the 80s, those handheld digital daytimers, like Frank Glenn used to make them.
Right.
So some of the original electronic Bible versions, and they still sell them, believe it or not, looks like an old electronic daytimer, which was quite a bit bigger and clunkier than my iPhone. And it had a flip-up screen. It had a standard QWERTY keyboard on it, but you could only see 4 lines of text. 4 lines of text at a time, right? And interestingly enough, as the internet started going, one of the very first items that was shared in this concept of shareware, where people just kind of shared software back and forth, one of the very first things was actually the King James Bible. And what happened was somebody had to hand type the entire King James Bible in ASCII, which is like now an ancient language, right? ASCII is a computer language, not an ancient actual spoken language. So, I mean, again, we live in such a privileged time. Now, last time I pointed out kind of the lineage of the Bibles that we have right now, and I pointed out that there were 3 main divisions within Christianity. You've got Catholicism, which, you know, back from the 4th century used the Latin Bible, and the modern versions are typically what are called the Douay Rheims. Then we have the Eastern Orthodox, which, by the way, Eastern Orthodoxy has a whole bunch of different subdivisions. So there's the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Asian Orthodox. There's several different subdivisions of Eastern Orthodoxy. And both the Eastern Orthodox as well as the Catholics claim to be the only true church and successors of the apostles, is one of the reasons why they split and why the Pope and the Patriarch excommunicated each other somewhere several centuries ago. And then we have the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s. Remember, we talked about the Great Bible, and we talked about the Geneva Bible, which had a very significant Calvinistic bent, and then the Bishop's Bible, which was authorized by the Queen of England to compete actually with the Geneva Bible. And eventually we ended up with the King James Bible. Now, I think, and what I want to try to do today as quickly as I can, because I want to get to a couple of really, I think, some very important questions about the Bible and about what we study, right? Because there's the discussion of the actual study habits, things that will make your study time more fruitful and beneficial. But we have to grapple with, well, what do we study? We have so many different Bible versions. Do they all say the same thing? Can we trust them all? So we need to go through a little bit more information and start talking about things like source text. And this, hopefully, I'm going to try to make this as interesting as I can. But depending on the Bible version you have, the source text for the Old Testament or the New Testament might be different. So, for example, with most Catholic and Protestant translations, the underlying text that's translated, say, into English is what's called the Hebrew Old Testament or what's called the Masoretic text. And this is quite interesting because the oldest surviving copy of the Hebrew Old Testament, anybody know what year it comes from? Or what era?
Middle Ages, wasn't it?
1100, about 1100 AD, not BC. Right? The earliest surviving Hebrew Old Testament is from over 1,000 years after Christ, which is why the Septuagint, which is kind of the mainstay of the Orthodox translations, the Greek Septuagint, which we refer to quite a bit, why the Septuagint has such great value, because the Septuagint was written or translated from Hebrew into Greek. Anybody know when?
About 215 BC.
About,
BC.
so right before 300 BC. Right, so literally there's a time gap of about 13 to 1400 years between the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, whether you have a King James, New King James, English Standard Version, NESB, doesn't really matter. Pretty much all of our Bibles, the Old Testament is based on the Hebrew Old Testament or the Masoretic text. Now, why might that be important for us to know and understand when we're reading and studying the Old Testament?
Be a bias, couldn't it?
What? Okay, bias, like what kind?
Anti-Jesus bias.
Yeah, in fact, you can go online, and I can't remember the name of the group, but there's a bunch of Messianic Jewish young men who go around the streets of Israel, Jerusalem, talking to people, asking them to read Isaiah 53, Isaiah 53, the one that talks about how I was pierced for their transgressions, and by my by his stripes we're healed. And they have them read this, and it's typically considered I don't know if it's considered the forbidden chapter in Isaiah, but it's a chapter that apparently, and I haven't proofed this, but apparently Jews don't read it.
True.
Right? And so if you compare, for example, Isaiah 53 in the Hebrew Old Testament to the Septuagint, there are some variant readings. And there are places throughout the Old Testament, particularly when it comes to prophecies about Christ, that there are notable differences between the Hebrew Old Testament and the Septuagint, the Greek version supporting the conclusion that yes, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God.
Psalm 22 is the big one that's really changed. I don't think Isaiah 53, I think they kind of messed up and didn't change that one. It's Psalm 22.
Psalm 22 is the
Yeah,
big
it
one.
doesn't show the one where my hands and feet were pierced. That's omitted. And when you read the Hebrew, it's like, huh?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense what they say when they're at that part. It's like they made something up and just makes no sense.
The bottom line is that most of us, when we just buy our Bibles, we don't think about these things, right? We just go and we buy a Bible, we find something that the print is large enough, the margins are big enough to write notes in. We kind of like the feel of the cover. I mean, we make decisions about the Bible we buy based on things other than what's the source material and what implication might that have for my understanding. Yeah.
Well, I was looking at the ESV on the way down here today, and I was reading some of the study notes and things like that, and I told Joe, I don't believe that. I mean, that's their bias.
That's
that
right.
they've written into those study notes. And because of your teaching, because of things Tim has taught as well, I know now, or I think, that the Septuagint is closer to that's what the apostles quoted, that's what Jesus
The
quoted.
vast majority
So-
of New Testament quotations of the Old Testament are from the
From that,
Septuagint.
and to me, that's kind of the ultimate authority anymore,
Yeah.
that I would look to instead of the Hebrew text.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Completely agreed. The New Testament now, that's kind of a general about the Old Testament. The New Testament, older translations, and this is where I want to spend some time talking about the different source texts for the New Testament, but older translations of the Bible, things like the Bishop's Bible or the Great Bible and even the King James, the Greek that those things are based on, generally based on what's commonly called the majority text and the textus receptus. And those two words or phrases or terms are commonly used to mean the same thing, although there actually are some differences, which I'll try to outline. Newer Bible translations, like the ESV, like the NIV or the NASB or the Amplified Bible or some of these other ones, These are based on a different source of original Greek language. So the older translations, like King James, New King James, based on the majority text. These newer translations, like we just talked about, are based on something that's commonly called the minority text, or sometimes it's called the critical text. Now, does this matter to us? What do you think?
Sure.
Why?
Because, for example, in the Alexandrian text, which is the text they use in the modern translations, there's over probably 1,000 disagreements within the same manuscripts that they have of that, and it's found that overall it's not a reliable source because of all the contradictions.
That depends on who you ask.
Oh, you ask, but
Who you ask.
But we have an early benefit of the early church fathers and their quotes, and when you look at their quotes, the vast majority of time, from what my understanding is, that they are more harmonious with the Textus Receptus than they are the Alexandrian text.
And it depends on which early church father you're
True.
looking at, right?
First
So we're
component
going to
is-
try to put all of this stuff together, because here's one of the questions I want to deal with at the end, like what Bible version should you own? Because that's kind of helpful, right? So we need to work our way towards, getting to the point when we try to answer that question, you go, okay, well, that makes sense based on everything that we've just discussed. So Walter is just talking about, he used a term called the Alexandrian text. So we're going to sort these terms out. But, before the printing press, of course, the source material that ended up being used to translate the Bible existed in manuscript form, right? There were no Bibles until someone put it all together into a book. And if you ever come across the word codex, the word codex just simply means book. But when you look at all of the different manuscripts that we have available to us with ancient languages on them, there are about 5,800 copies or fragments. In fact, there are some manuscripts that are used in Bible translation, what we call textual criticism, where scholars are comparing the different versions or readings of the same text. There are some fragments that are literally as small as like 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches, right? So please don't think that somewhere from ancient time we have a perfectly preserved copy of the New Testament in the original Greek that came from the year 97. Doesn't exist, right? It doesn't exist at all. But we do have 5,800 copies of fragments of the Greek New Testament. Now they're scattered around different ages and they're categorized into different traditions. Walter used the term Alexandrian. But beyond the 5,800, we also have about 10,000 Latin manuscripts. And we have about 9,300 manuscripts that are in other ancient languages like Coptic and Gothic and Syrian, Aramaic. And so these Greek manuscripts, or the Greek manuscripts referencing the 5,800 at the top there, they can be roughly broken down into two families. Now you'll notice up in the top left corner there's what's called the Western tradition, which scholars typically agree is pretty corrupted, and it is more paraphrastic, meaning it's not going to show you exact copies of, say, Matthew 12:14. It's more paraphrased rather than actual literal translation. So the two main families, or two different traditions that give us the source material that scholars use to translate into Bibles, fall into one of two different traditions. One is called the Byzantine tradition, and manuscripts that come from the Byzantine tradition typically are dated from the 5th to about the 16th century. Yes. It says 6th there, it should say 16th. And these are considered late manuscripts, right? Because we're going from the reference point of when Christ walked the earth. So an early manuscript would show up maybe in the 2nd century, a late manuscript would be the 9th, 10th, or whatever. So the Byzantine tradition is considered from a scholarly perspective to be late, yet it accounts for the vast majority, easily 80% of all the Greek manuscripts that we have available to us to create any translation of the Bible come from this Byzantine tradition. Now, why is it called Byzantine? Well, I've got a map up here, and you can see that the word Byzantine actually points, or the Byzantine tradition points to Antioch. And this is because these Greek manuscripts and fragments were actually found in and around Antioch and Turkey and ancient Syria. This is also commonly known as the majority text. And it's called the majority text because these manuscripts represent the largest portion of these 5,800 different Greek manuscripts that we have. And again, it's at least 80%. I've seen other references that suggest 85 to 90%. Nevertheless, the majority of Greek manuscripts fall into what's called the Byzantine tradition. And this is the source for what is called the Textus Receptus. So again, people will use the term majority text and Textus Receptus as if they are the same thing. They're not quite, but essentially they are. When you start really breaking down the differences, there are a bunch of differences, but we'll clarify what I mean by that just a little bit. Now, the other tradition is what Walter mentioned. This is the Alexandrian tradition. You'll note that this is pointing to Alexandria, Egypt. Now, what is significant about, or what's important to know about the difference or the similarities between Christianity in Antioch versus Christianity in Alexandria, Egypt, back in ancient times? Does anybody know what's significant? Go ahead.
Didn't you say that's where the first seminary was, and that's where Paul
Which one?
was? The first seminary at Antioch, like 100 and something.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's argument as to whether or not the seminary in Alexandria or Antioch was the first, but certainly back during that time, there were two schools that showed up in each of these places that we can consider these initial seminaries. But Kathy just mentioned Paul. Antioch, according to the Bible, is the first place that Christians were called Christians. It was also Paul's home base. It was the place from which he was sent out to do all of his missionary journeys. And basically, the Byzantine tradition was adopted by the Orthodox churches, and in general, the teachings in and around that area reflect more Orthodox views of Christianity and doctrine. Now, what do we need to know about Alexandria? Well, first of all, the city was, I believe, founded by the Ptolemies, who were Greek kings of Egypt. And I think we talked last week about how it was Ptolemy II who commissioned the writing or the translation of the Septuagint. And the reason for that is because this is where the Library of Alexandria was. And Alexandria was basically a hotbed of Greek philosophy. The Jews that moved to and lived there were typically Hellenized. They were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, art, culture, language. And as you track through church history, you start to get the very clear impression that a lot of our common false doctrines actually had their roots in early church writers who basically were influenced by the teachings coming in and out of Alexandria. So there's a very heavy Greek philosophical, Hellenistic, as well as Gnostic influence on the Alexandrians. Now, the Alexandrian tradition, or the manuscripts that come from that tradition, are considered early because they date to somewhere in the early 4th century, like 305, 310, 315 after Christ. And that's quite a gap from some of the Byzantine majority manuscripts that might date, say, from the 15th or 16th century, right? So going back to, it depends which tradition and which source material is better. It really just depends on who you ask. And quite honestly, biblical scholars for hundreds of years have been split. I shouldn't say for hundreds of years. For the last 100 years, maybe two, have been split over which is the most reliable, accurate, and authoritative source of raw material from which to create translations of the Bible. So the Alexandrian tradition is also known as the minority text because it represents a very small proportion of the total amount of Greek manuscripts that are available for scholars to create these different translations. And even though there are a handful of Greek source texts that represent this Alexandrian tradition, there are two works called Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus that basically make up the bulk of what's considered the Alexandrian tradition or the minority text. Now, again, I just said that the word codex means what?
Book.
It means book. And so the history of these, and actually I think I have a few more comments about this just a little bit later. But Codex Vaticanus has been known to exist since about the 15th century. And it's called Codex Vaticanus because it's been housed where? In the Vatican, right? In the library in the Vatican. And Codex Sinaiticus was discovered by a man named Tischendorf in the 1800s. We'll come back to him a little bit later. And it was called Codex Sinaiticus because he found it in a trash bin in a monastery that was at the foot of Mount Sinai. And he pulled it out and kind of looked at it and realized, wow, this is like an almost entirely complete ancient Bible. And both the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus are near complete copies of the entire Bible. Both of them, the Old Testament, is derived from the Septuagint. They're not entirely complete, but they're fairly close. And the Greek Testament, the Greek New Testament, comes from a Greek tradition that is different than these. Different than the majority text. Different than what is called the Byzantine. Now, going back to the Byzantine again, it's called the majority text. Why? Because it accounts for the vast majority of the Greek manuscripts that we have. The word is extant, it just means existing. But the vast majority of the extant Greek manuscripts are from this majority Byzantine tradition. The other thing that kind of supports the accuracy and reliability is that the Byzantine manuscripts come from a very wide geographic distribution, whereas Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus came only from here. We don't have evidence of this type of literature, even though it's older, even though it's considered early. We don't see wide geographic distribution. Now, why might that be important from a scholarly perspective? If you're sitting down and you have a whole bunch of manuscripts and you're going to make a translation of a Bible, would you prefer to use older material that was only found in one place, or an abundance of material that came from later but was found everywhere and it all agreed with each other? Which would you prefer to use?
The latter, of course.
The latter. Now, not everyone believes that.
No.
Not everyone believes that. And we'll come back to that later. So even though the Byzantine tradition here, this majority text, dates, the earliest manuscript dates from the 5th century, like 400 and something AD. There are quotes in the early church fathers as early as the 2nd century, as early as the 2nd century, that agree with the Byzantine tradition. So even though we don't have an actual manuscript from the 2nd century, we have identical quotations from people who lived and wrote in the 2nd century that agree with the Byzantine tradition. Are you guys tracking with me so far? It's a lot of numbers, a lot of different names, but trust me, is the more you hear it, the easier it gets. The majority text is the source material for the Textus Receptus. And this is why I said earlier that the Textus Receptus is not identical to nor totally synonymous with the majority text, but the majority text is the source for the Textus Receptus. And I'll track that history in a second. And the majority text in the Textus Receptus is the Greek language base for the German Bible that Luther wrote, and it's also the source material for the New Testament of Tyndale and Coverdale's Great Bible, the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and the King James and the New King James Version. Now, out of all the Bibles that you can lay your hands on right now, there's only a couple that actually come out of the Byzantine tradition. Everything else is translated from the Alexandrian text, what's called the minority tradition or the minority text. Any questions or comments so far? We good? Okay, let's talk about the Textus Receptus. Remember, we're dealing with two families or traditions of manuscripts. One is early, meaning it's older but there's only a couple of them, which are only found in a couple of places. And as Walter said a moment ago, I don't know if you caught it, when you compare Codex Vaticanus with Sinaiticus, they don't always agree with each other. And in fact, there is more disagreement within those two texts than there is within all the other Greek manuscripts that come from the majority text tradition. Or to say it another way, the Byzantine tradition, even though it's considered later work, meaning it's from later centuries, it's younger, there's a high degree of internal consistency within each of those fragments or larger manuscripts, right? High internal consistency. So let's talk about the Textus Receptus, because remember, the Textus Receptus is a result of putting together all of the majority text, and it really is the basis for the translation of the New King James, which is my preference. I'll just put that out there. That's my preference, just for general study and reading. But the Textus Receptus is actually the result, like the most up-to-date, I shouldn't say up-to-date because the most up-to-date version is from the 1800s. But the edition that was published in the 1800s is actually the result of a chain of custody or custodialism that started with a man named Desiderius Erasmus back in the 1500s. And what Erasmus did basically is he took the majority text and he created the first critical analysis of the Greek New Testament, of all the Byzantine manuscripts that were available. And he put them all together and he compared all the different variant readings, and he created this work that eventually became known as the Textus Receptus. That name actually didn't come about until quite a bit later. And he published multiple editions of his early work between the years of 1516 and 1535. He published 4 different editions, and the third one basically became the most widely respected and widely used by other biblical scholars. And when he sat down with these manuscripts, he, on average, had 3 to 4 copies of the Gospels, 3 to 4 copies of the Pauline epistles and letters. And he had one copy of the book of Revelation, which interestingly was missing the final page. And instead of waiting around to find a copy that had the final page, he took Jerome's Latin Vulgate and he translated the final 6 verses of Revelation from the Latin Vulgate that Jerome did and put it into his New Testament. Very interesting, right? And what's even more interesting is that the very first edition of the Textus Receptus that Erasmus produced, he was basically in a race to beat another group or another translator, which produced a work called the Complutensian Polyglot. It's like, who talks like this anymore? But the word polyglot basically means there's 2 languages together on the same page. Like you could have like Hebrew and Greek together, or Greek and Latin. So he was racing to be the first one to publish and print a Greek New Testament. And in his haste, produced his first edition, which was full of typos. And it was so bad that he had to go back and fix them all. And understand this. This is only about 60 years or so, 70 years after the printing press. They had to hire somebody, like almost think about a die caster. They actually had to create, because type at that point, you had to have a little block for every single letter in whatever language that you were, and you had to have multiple copies of that. And they had to be hand placed to be able to create a printed page, right? So they had to go out and hire someone to actually make these little letters that the printers could use. I mean, this was a very, very expensive proposition, so it was not easy to print a Bible, to get it published. So anyways, he had all these typos that he had to go back and correct, and shortly after he put his first edition out, the group that did the Complutensian Polyglot published theirs, and so when he got to do a second or third edition, he used their work, and he compared his work to their translation and made improvements over his work. Right, and what we're starting to see, because I said last time that the 1500s was a period of biblical chaos, because you had all these people competing to translate the Greek and the Latin and get it into English, and who's got the best Bible? Is it the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible? The King James eventually won out over all of them. Well, come along, well, 30 years or so later, this French guy, Robert Estienne, his Latin name is Stephanus, some people call him Stevens. He basically took the third edition of Erasmus and did more scholarly work and research. And he himself produced 4 editions of Erasmus's work, again, still called the Textus Receptus in this kind of chain of progression. And in 1550, he produced the 3rd edition, which, out of all of the different versions of the Textus Receptus, is considered the most scholarly. It actually, Stevens was the very first one to incorporate references to the actual manuscripts that he used in his translation. So he had footnotes. You know how in Tim's translation in the LGB, he'll have footnotes? And he might say, hey, the minority text says this, but I chose this reading for this reason. That's what Stevens started. He's also the guy who started putting in verses in his translations. If you remember, I think it was Jerome that broke the Latin Vulgate into chapters, but Stevens is the one who started to put everything into verses, and that tradition, of course, has continued on. After Stevens produced his critical 3rd edition, about 15 years later, another guy named Theodore Beza, who was successor, he was basically the spiritual successor to John Calvin in Geneva. So he was a Calvinist. He took Stephanus's or Stephen's Greek text and he edited it 9 times over a period of about 40 years. He created 9 different editions of the Textus Receptus. And now we're into the early 1600s, and what Beza did was he started adding commentary, he started adding notes. So Judy, your Bible that you were talking about earlier, you were reading the editorial comments, and you're like, well, I don't agree with that. Well, this is what's happening. If you buy a study Bible, all of the commentary, all of the explanations comes from the mind of the translators, which is typically a board of people, quite often from a given doctrinal position, right? It's going to be, I'm going to use the word corrupted, but it's basically going to be infused with the opinions of the people who are providing the translation. Well, Beza was the first one who did this, and he was a Calvinist, right? Number 2 to Calvin. Now, he was very often criticized during his time for letting his views on things like predestination affect his translation. Very, very interesting. We're talking about 500 years ago. We see translational bias already showing up in the historical record of the Bible. Now again, it was just after this in 1611 that the King James was published by the Church of England. And that was in addition to the Bishop's Bible, which was their very first official authorized version. And the King James Version, I don't know if you know this part about history, the King James history, basically there was a perceived need. There was a segment of the Church of England that believed that the Church of England still had to be purified of its Calvinistic roots. And these people were known as Puritans. So it was the Puritan segment within the Anglican Church that drove the translation of the King James Bible. Now the King James was translated by 47 different men who during their proceedings and meetings spoke only Latin. When they met together to translate, they only spoke Latin. And they used Beza's text from 1565 as their main text, but what they did is they just didn't take Beza's word for it. They compared his work to the prior editions of Stevens and Erasmus, and even used the Complutensian Polyglot. So the King James Bible is perhaps the best earliest example of what is called textual criticism, which is, hey, let's look at everything that's available and let's decide what's right, what's accurate, what's consistent, what has the most evidence behind it, that we can say, okay, this is what this means and this is how we put it into English. Now later, a man named Scribner, he identified 109 different places where King James Version translators differed from Beza's original work, and Scribner worked in the middle to late 1800s. And he himself published a version of the Textus Receptus, which generally, if you look at a Bible and see, or somebody talks about the Textus Receptus, typically they're talking about Scribner's version from 1864. And instead of starting with the Greek material and retranslating it and creating a new English version of this, what he actually did was he reverse engineered the Greek New Testament from the King James. He actually took the King James Bible, retranslated it back into Greek, and compared his Greek translation of the English to all the Greek that was translated by each of these guys over a period of the last 100 years. Can you imagine how much work that takes? I mean, talk to Tim and ask him how long it took him to translate the book of John. A long time. These guys, for the most part, this was their life's work. So here we are. Now we're talking about the late 1800s. Remember that in 1611, the King James came along, but it took a couple of decades for the King James to become the dominant version that was used. Scrivener comes along, creates kind of like the ultimate version of the Textus Receptus. So now here we are in the late 1800s, which is another critical time in the history of our Bibles, because this is now where things like Codex Sinaiticus were discovered. This guy is Baron von Tischendorf. You guys ever see The Princess Bride?
Yes, I love it.
Doesn't he look
Yes,
like
he does.
the Sicilian?
Yeah.
Inconceivable! Looks exactly, to me, it looks like that guy with hair.
It does.
So Tischendorf, again, I mentioned earlier that he was in a monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. He discovered a copy of the Bible, again, mostly intact, that became known as the Codex Sinaiticus. It contained an incomplete but mostly intact Septuagint, as well as a Greek New Testament. But the Greek that was underlying this was different than what you see in Erasmus's work, or Stephen's work, or Beza's work, or the compilation and the work of Scrivener. And so Scrivener and Tischendorf and some other scholars around that time basically became textual critical opponents. Because for the last several hundred years, the only manuscripts that were available was the Byzantine majority text. Even though Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were in existence, nobody knew about it. So Tischendorf comes along and he grabs this. He goes to visit the Pope and says, "Hey, can I see your Vaticanus?" And he was allowed to actually hand copy a couple of pages of that. He was obviously not given it. They weren't going to give that up. But now, in the late 1800s, launched a brand new branch of textual criticism, which is based on a completely different tradition. This has just happened around at a time, in particular in Germany, in the late 1800s, where philosophical and critical thinking was kind of entering a new era. And there was almost this theme like the old stuff doesn't cut it, we need new stuff. We need new ways of thinking about things. And so all of a sudden, what ended up happening, oh, by the way, Codex Vaticanus, mentioned also from the 4th century, known from the 15th century, right, in the library in Rome, was captured or taken as spoils of war by Napoleon and brought back to Paris. And it was later returned to the Vatican in 1815. Very interesting, right? So these two manuscripts, which really make up the bulk of this minority text, this Alexandrian text, a tradition that comes out of a geographic area that was heavily tainted with Gnostic heresy, became the primary source material for two men named Westcott and Hort. And Westcott and Hort basically started this new interpretational paradigm that said older is better, period. That's where they came from. They were opponents of the majority text, opponents of the King James Version. Now, before I go too much further, I just want to mention this. Have you guys, anybody here heard about the Peshitta? The Peshitta is basically an Aramaic translation And Messianic synagogues and Hebrew roots movement people tend to prefer the Peshitta because their thought process goes like this. Well, Jesus spoke Aramaic. This is written in Aramaic. Therefore, this is the Bible that Jesus had. So the Peshitta basically has a classic Aramaic version of the Old Testament, which was translated into Hebrew from the Latin Vulgate, typically somewhere around the 4th century or so. And then the New Testament was translated from Greek into Aramaic around the 4th century. The problem with this idea that the Peshitta was the original Bible, and there are many people that believe this. Classical Aramaic, which is what the Peshitta is written in, only showed up as a dialect about 300 years after Christ. And we have ancient writings, like, for example, Aramaic scholars know what early Galilean Aramaic looked like because they have manuscripts from there. They have pottery shards with language that they can look at the grammar and the syntax. And they say, hey, this is different than classical Aramaic. So clearly we know that the Peshitta is not the original Bible. However, because it was translated into Aramaic from Latin, which was translated from Greek, and the New Testament was translated from Greek at a fairly early time period, it just becomes another reference point. Now, according to some of the articles that I read about this, the Peshitta tends to paraphrase in some areas, so it's not necessarily a literal translation. And depending on which part, sometimes it agrees with the Byzantine, sometimes it agrees with the Alexandrian. So it certainly is not an absolute objective tertiary reference point that you can go, okay, well, I don't know which translation, let me just check the Peshitta. Sometimes it's used that way, sometimes you don't get any answers. But what I was saying earlier, based off what Walter said, is that whether or not these older texts from the Alexandrian tradition versus the Byzantine or the majority text from the Byzantine tradition are more accurate, it really depends on who you ask. You guys remember the old Miller Lite commercials? Tastes great, less filling. Yes? I'm not advocating drinking Miller Lite, but just if you've seen the commercial. So, the people who hold to the minority text or the Alexandrian tradition basically say older is better. End of argument. However, the majority text proponents say that the more recent translations of the majority text, the Byzantine tradition, and the numbers that we have, the internal consistency, the wide geographic distribution, implies preservation. It implies preservation. Daniel Wallace, who's a kind of a modern Greek scholar, says that if you look at all of the Greek manuscripts that are available, there's about 300,000 textual variations among them all. And most of those variations come from Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and they don't even agree with each other to a high degree of reliability. However, having said that, even though there's like 300,000 different textual variants, about 85% of them are word order and spelling changes, which have really no implications for translation or effect interpretation. So the vast majority of the differences are inconsequential from a scholarly standpoint. The majority text, remember we talked about the majority text and the Textus Receptus not being the same thing. The Textus Receptus is a collation of all of the different majority texts, but it has its own tradition of going through several different hands and multiple editions over a period of about 100 years. But if you took, say, Scrivener's his Textus Receptus from the 1800s, and you compared it to the original majority text manuscripts, there are 1,838 disagreements. Almost 2,000. It sounds like a lot, doesn't it? I mean, if you put up two groups of raw material and said, how close are these? And you went, well, there's like almost 2,000 differences between these. Well, that sounds like a lot until you realize that there are over 3.1 million characters in the Bible. 1,838 differences does not represent all that much. In fact, the Textus Receptus and the majority text agree over 99% of the time, even when you look at things like word order and spelling. Yeah.
I was gonna ask, those 2,000 errors could possibly be like grammatical?
That's
or
right, and it could simply be,
punctuation or
yeah,
stuff
well,
like
there's
that?
no punctuation in the originals,
Right,
because
right,
these ancient languages didn't use that. But scribal errors,
right.
you know, make a plural when it should be singular,
Right.
or, you know, just flip two words around, right? Very simple things that don't affect ultimately how we interpret things. Now, again, remember that the Textus Receptus is a critical work that compared and collated all the Greek manuscripts, but beyond that, they actually included references to the Latin. Now, the Textus Receptus, again drawn from the majority text, differs from the Alexandrian tradition, the minority text, in about 6,500 places. Now, it's a lot more. It's about 3.5 times more differences. We look at the Textus Receptus and compare it to the majority text, about 1,800 differences. Compare Textus Receptus to the minority text, 6,500. So the differences from that Textus Receptus, it's about 3.5 times more on the Alexandrian side, on the minority text side. But that still only accounts for maybe 2% of the whole. So when you compare the majority text to the minority text, it still agrees about 98% of the time. So here's my question. Does it matter if we read an English translation that comes from the majority text and Textus Receptus versus the minority text and the Alexandrian tradition? Does it matter if we study either one?
Depending on the person, I suppose. For example, a new believer, newcomer to Christ, the general message I think can kind of be extrapolated regardless of which text you look at. But when you're starting to break down as you mature and grow, then it probably does matter, because then you'll get more of the richness of it itself.
Okay. But if they're all kind of coming from the same source material and there's such a, like only a 98% versus a 99% agreement and only a 2 versus a 1% disagreement, does it make that much difference? Or does the difference really depend not necessarily on the source material? I'm not saying that it's not important. Does the difference depend more on who's translating it and what their bias is?
Bingo.
Bingo. Now, having said that, when you compare, for example, the NIV to the King James, NIV would be based on the minority text. King James, New King James would be compared to or based on the majority text in the Textus Receptus. When you compare those, aside from the changes like word order, grammar, whatever, there are actually 16 verses, entire verses missing from the modern translations that you find in King James, New King James. Here's a list. I'm not going to go through them, but if you want to take a picture of that, or you know what, I can text this out on WhatsApp tomorrow if you guys wanted to look at it. But honestly, all you have to do is go to Google and say list of verses missing from NIV, and you'll come up with this list. Right? These verses are well known. These verses are, you know, topic of scholarly debate, and of course the debate always centers around this question: which is better, early or late? Which manuscript tradition do you think is the most accurate?
Which
And-
affects doctrine.
It can, right? But it doesn't necessarily affect doctrine because of, I'd say that there are probably a few places in the actual source material that makes a difference, but I do think that the greatest potential to affect doctrine comes from how the people creating the English translation is treating and handling the source material. That's where I think the main issue comes from for you and I. Because just like Judy was saying, I read the commentary in the ESV and I didn't agree with that. Well, guess what? That Bible was translated by people using the minority text as source material, and they have a certain mindset and belief, and they will translate that source material in a way that agrees with what they believe.
Are all ESV versions Exactly, translated by the same people.
Yes, and we'll come to these modern translations, and
And I remember Tim told me that to be on a translating committee, you have to believe in the Trinity.
pretty much. But you don't have to be of the same denomination, which is
Right.
quite interesting.
Right.
And I'll come back to that in a second. So, here's the good thing, is that scholars today have ready access to every copy that underlines, or every manuscript that like crying out loud. In my Bible software, I have a module where I can actually go into my textual criticism module and I can see pictures of all these 5,800 manuscripts. If I wanted to start like cracking my teeth on textual criticism and actually look at the original languages, I have pictures of all of these things. They're out there, right? So it's not like only certain people have access to these, but any scholar who wants to translate has almost immediate access to all the manuscripts that underline the majority text, the Textus Receptus. We have the Greek versions of the Textus Receptus, all of the different guys. We have access to the minority text, to the Latin Vulgate, to the Aramaic Peshitta. We have it all. So anyone who wants to translate for themselves has no lack of data to work from. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, hey, y'all, you guys need to start translating the original languages. Part of your spiritual discipline study habits is you got to learn Greek. Sorry.
Just go learn Greek, buy a Greek Bible. There you go.
No, I'm not saying that at all. But, we have these two main traditions that basically have been birthed out of a very wide range of source material that ultimately comes down to two different types of translations. We have, and let me show you. Here's how it breaks down. We have, oops, what is going on there? I have no idea, but that's kind of funky. What's that? It is animation, but it's not supposed to do that. So, the King James, what you should see under the King James there, the 1611 King James, is the New King James, which was written, I believe it was in when was that? Let me just...
Really?
No, I'm sorry, not 18. It was like 1982, something
Oh.
like that.
I was gonna say, no, was that?
No, it wasn't that early. Yeah, it was 1982. Let me do this. I'm going to get rid of all my animations. Yeah, let's get rid of all of that. That should work better. There we go. So the majority text in the Textus Receptus, of course, this gave us the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible, and the Bishop's Bible, but we're talking 1600s. But in modern times, the Bibles that come out of the majority text, Textus Receptus, are the King James and the New King James. And the New King James essentially is King James with modern English, and it was published in 1982. Go ahead.
I think Young's also came from that.
Yeah. There's way more. It's just there's
Not
only
many though.
Yeah, there's only so many names that I can throw at you, names and numbers. So on the minority text, remember we talked about Tischendorf and how in, I think it was 1849, he found Codex Vaticanus. Well, we already had the Codex Sinaiticus, so these guys called Westcott and Hort over in Europe basically took Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and created a brand new New Testament Greek, which is now called the minority text. And in 1898, they used that to produce what's called the English Revised Version, the ERV. And in their scholarly work, they changed the text away from the King James translation in about 30,000 different places. About 30,000. Now, not to be outdone, a couple of years later, the Americans said, hey, we want to create our own version based on this minority text. And as the editorial board for the American Standard Version started to work, any changes that they wanted to do had to be approved by Westcott and Hort, who were the main translators of the English Revised Version. And the American Standard Version in 1901 had 30 translators that came from 10 different denominations. Now, what's the problem with that you might perceive or anticipate? Well, yes, and so when I say different denominations, they're obviously Christian denominations, but you had Anabaptists and Baptists and Anglicans and Wesleyans. You had Unitarians.
Calvinists.
Oh yeah, what's that?
Calvinists.
Calvinists. You had all of these.
Just eschatology alone would be.
So
ridiculous.
here's my question. If you've got 30 different translators from 10 different denominations who don't all agree on certain points of doctrine, is the tendency to hammer out the doctrine to the point where they all agree, or to translate to the lowest common belief?
Homogenize.
Homogenize, right? Homogenize. The American Standard Version, which is what eventually became the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, it's the updated version, was used by the Jehovah's Witnesses until about 1922 when they came out with, 1992, when they came out with their own translation called the New World Translation. Yeah, and that's again based off the minority text. And the American Standard Version, which was really the American version of the English Revised Version, which is based on 2 manuscripts that don't agree with each other. That's the basis for about 6 other versions, including the Revised Standard Version, which is now the ESV. That's now the ESV, the English Standard Version. It was the New Revised, also resulted in the New Revised Standard Version 1989, the Amplified Bible 1965, the Recovery Version 1999, and the World English Bible in 2000, and everyone's favorite paraphrase, the Living Bible in 1971. All coming out of this revised minority text tradition. Now, let me tell you this. The vast majority of modern biblical scholars follow this tradition because they believe earlier or older is better. End of discussion. And they have all these arguments as to why the majority text is unreliable. And it's very interesting. If you go back and you read some of the quotations from these biblical scholars back in the 16, 17, and 1800s as they were arguing back and forth, they were very nasty. Right? People from the minority text tradition talking about the King James as being like, seed of the devil, and anyone who reads that is on a pathway to hell. And I mean, they were not kind when they were talking to each other. Now, all of this brings me to the questions that I wanted to try to answer today. One of the questions is when we start looking at this history of the Bible, and the fact that we have all these different manuscripts from what we consider to be the ancient world, right? Maybe it's the near ancient world, up to the 16th century. How does the Bible stack up against other ancient documents? Like, can we really trust that the things that we find written in these manuscripts or in Codex Sinaiticus, how can we trust that that was accurate and true? Because one of the arguments, of course, on the atheistic side is, there's all kinds of changes and errors and people fudge things just to make it, sound more fantastical.
There's so many manuscripts that they found that it makes
The larger numbers, wider geographic distribution, a lot of consistency implies accuracy and
Yes.
validity, doesn't it? It really does. But here's the thing. Secular historians, they base their understanding of history on the writings of people who lived and wrote about events in whatever time frame they're thinking about or studying, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? How do we know what happened in ancient Rome, for example? Well, we have writings. In fact, Julius Caesar wrote something called the Gallic War. He wrote that somewhere between 58 and 50 BC, and it catapulted him into popularity in the Roman Empire. Now, modern secular historians, in trying to understand culture and history of Rome, read the Gallic Wars as part of their source material. But whereas we have 5,800, and if you include the Latin and the other languages, we have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of textual evidence. Do you know how many copies of the Gallic War exist?
2.
10. 10.
It's the same thing with like Plato, Socrates, and all those other people.
Yeah.
The amount that they have.
So listen to this in terms of time frame. First of all, there's only 10 manuscripts. There's only 10 copies of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. They were written somewhere around 58 to 50 BC. The oldest surviving copy we have of this comes from somewhere around 850 AD, 900 years after the events that they're describing. There's 10 copies, and the earliest version we have is 900 years later. How does that compare to the earliest writings? Like, there are some manuscripts that we have, some of the fragments that are from the 2nd century that support the Bible. You're only talking, 200 years removed from the actual events. And so the secular historians go, you guys have no proof. And I'm like, really? What about the Gallic Wars? Well, what about Livy's Roman history? He was born somewhere, around the turn of not the century, but going from BC to AD. So somewhere between 59 and BC and AD 17, I think it was. So his work called Roman History, only 1/3 of the content of his work actually is surviving. And the oldest copy comes from AD 350, which is more than 300 years after the time that he wrote it. Yet it's considered valid proof of the history of Rome. Tacitus wrote annals and histories about 110 AD, the oldest copy, about the 10th century AD. About 1,000 years after he wrote those things, and he has other minor works that are bound in a 10th century codex, and the oldest copies again are 800 to 900 years removed from the time when they were written. Thucydides' history wrote somewhere between 460 400 BC. The oldest copy comes from AD 900. That's 1,400 years after the events that he describes. Herodotus lived around 480 BC, and the oldest copy of his work dates from 800 AD, again 12 to 1,300 years after he wrote it. So when we look at how the manuscript tradition of the Bible stacks up against secular ancient documents, we are hands down the winner. We have way more, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of documents that are from way closer to the events that they describe than the secular histories, which basically is the source material for the history books that all our kids are learning in school. And they say we have no proof. The summary is that ancient secular history has a very weak manuscript tradition. The manuscripts are historically late, meaning removed from the events. They're very few in number. However, the reliability is never questioned. Never questioned. And this is what, to me, one of the things that's so impressive about the Bible. And listen, if we focus, and just give me a few more minutes, you guys got to get used to me saying that.
We are.
Yeah, I know. If we focus only on the Gospels, for example, we have the entire Gospel text in Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus from about the 2nd century, right? 200 years or so after the originals. We have hundreds of manuscripts that are just a few hundred years old, and we have thousands of manuscripts that predate the Gutenberg printing press in the 1400s. We have no lack of manuscript tradition. We have no massive time gaps. We have a rich source of material for comparison, for textual criticism, that implies a record of preservation. Think about, all the verses that we commonly quote when we talk about how God will preserve his word. And we have way more than any ancient secular work. Way more. Here's another question.
It's an inconvenient truth.
Here's another question. How long did the original manuscripts of the Bible last? And let's even include the earliest copies of the original manuscripts.
Not very, because of the materials that it was written on.
Well, I don't have a paperback book here, but how long, like if you guys, anybody here have a paperback book from when they were a kid?
Yep.
Yeah. How long do we expect these modern books to last? Especially, if you're reading them a lot.
Generation.
I showed you my Bible last week, right? And I've used that a lot over the last 10 years, and it's falling apart. 10 years. Well, actually, it's probably a little bit more than that, probably 15 years ago. So here's something interesting. Let's say that the book of Matthew was written about 75 AD. And let's assume, just for the sake of the illustration, that the original letter that Matthew wrote lasted for 10 years, and it was falling apart because it was just used over and over and over again, and it had to be copied, and that copy lasted for 10 years, and it fell apart, and it had to be copied, and every 10 years or so, you had to copy or recopy the original, so that at the end of, say, 100 years, or 50, 100 years, up to 80, 250 or whatever, maybe you've got 15 different copies, right? Every 10 years, every 15 years, you got to create another copy. So you would end up having 15 different copies over that next 100 years or so, which probably would have some variations because every time you copy it, there's some scribal errors. I mean, this is well known in scholarly work, like scribes make mistakes. So what do you think the last copy, the 15th copy, if you had the original compared to, would it look the same or would it be different? It probably would be different, right? So the question is, does the evidence support this? Does the evidence support that these ancient writings only lasted 10 years, 15 years and had to be copied? And the answer is no, not even close. There was a study published by a guy named George Houston in 2009 that compared the contents of 53 different libraries, not books, libraries, entire libraries. And these were libraries that were dumped, most of them in the sands of Egypt, around the same time, preserving the entire library. And most of these were recovered from a place in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. And what Houston's study showed is that of the 50, and there's Oxyrhynchus there just southwest of Cairo, of the 53 different entire libraries that were discovered in Oxyrhynchus, the smallest library contained about 100 books, the largest about 1,000. And in total, in these 53 libraries, there were about 500,000 pieces of literature. Now, we're not talking about personal correspondence. We're talking about books. And guess what? They loaned them out. And they found records, library records that said, hey, we sent a letter to so-and-so saying, return your copy of whatever. It's just like a modern library. Now, based on Houston's analysis of these library records, he discovered that most books were in use for anywhere from 150 to 500 years, the originals. Up to 500 years. The average was about 200 to 300 years. A far cry from the 10 that we kind of posited with Matthew's Gospel. Imagine this, Matthew's Gospel was still around 200 years after he wrote it. So what does this mean for us? And more specifically for our example using Matthew. Well, instead of every 10 years a new copy, the original was still likely in circulation in 225. If he wrote it in 75 AD, 150 years later, it was probably still there. And in fact, it could easily have survived into the 3rd century, late 3rd century. Now think about this, John's Revelation we were just talking about, right? John wrote it just before 100 AD. It could have still been in circulation and available for someone to put their hands on and read in 400 AD. That's crazy to me, yes.
I've had two thoughts in regards to the books. Like, number one, back when they were writing and making these copies, were they actually books as we know them today? Were they binded up or were they just sheets of paper?
They were parchments. They were
Right.
parchments.
So
yeah.
I would imagine that they would last a little bit longer because they're not binded up in
Well,
that manner.
yeah. Well, now Walter said, and I'm not like trying to correct you or anything, but the materials that they were printed on were very durable. They were printed on papyrus,
Right.
and they were printed on vellum, which was animal skin, and these things lasted for hundreds of years. In fact, I think it's either Vaticanus or Sinaiticus there's evidence that the original was re-inked 500 years after, or whatever copy we have from the 4th century, was re-inked in certain places 500 years later. They lasted hundreds of years.
So this makes me think of the other thought I had, which is going back to in the beginning of this lesson was, you know, as far as the Torah and the Messianic tradition and how they, you know, have it put up in, you know, it's like preserving it to last that much longer because it's a scroll. Essentially, it's just a long, big scroll of paper where, you know, they've written all the books, the 5 books of the Bible, first 5 books of the Bible. So that also makes me think, I'm sure that's probably the reason why they do it in that manner, to preserve it that much longer.
Yeah, so and you'd see, if you see these ancient, there's basically 2 poles, and it's rolled around each one, right? And so you wouldn't unroll the whole thing, find the place you're looking for, and then re-roll it. You would unroll one and roll up the other side, so only certain amounts were actually exposed to the atmosphere.
Right.
And it was very, very quick and very short. So there was, I mean, all different reasons, but here's, you know, one of the reasons why they found 53 entire libraries in Oxyrhynchus is because of the humidity and the dryness. Like Egypt and something buried in the sands of Egypt, it's going to survive a long time. Think about the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, right? They were discovered in the 1900s, right, by a shepherd boy. But inside these pottery jars that were sealed, there were over 200 intact scrolls, including a perfect entire copy of the book of Isaiah written about 125 BC. And it was discovered in the 1900s. I believe it was the early 1900s, like 1930 somewhere. I might be off on the date there. You know, so this idea that manuscripts deteriorated very, very quickly and had to be recopied very early and frequently, which would introduce all kinds of errors, which would mean we would not have thousands of manuscripts from the 15th and 16th century or up until then that all agreed with each other. It strongly implies that we had the original around for a very long time, which would have been used for reference to correct any error, any doctrine, because the originals were still there, and you can't question that. Tertullian wrote in 190 BC. Now, he went off the rails later in his faith career, became a Montanist, basically heretic. But early on, his writings are actually pretty spot on. And he wrote a book called Prescription Against Heresies. In chapter 36, he was writing against some of the heresies where people had taken Paul's letters and basically corrupted them and said, hey, here's what Paul's saying. And so he's arguing against these heretical copies of Paul's letters, and basically he urged his readers to go check out Paul's original, which was in Hierapolis. And this was 190 AD. And you're talking, Paul was killed in 68, 69 AD, so you're talking about 130 years later. Paul's originals were still there. Another guy named Bishop Peter, who lived in the early 4th century, referred to the original, the Gospel of John, which was housed in a library in Ephesus. So these manuscripts lasted a long time. Now, and I got like 2 more questions, maybe 3, no 2. How many original manuscripts were there? They're called autographs.
One of everything.
Yeah, so how many books in the New Testament are there?
66.
New Testament, that's the whole Bible.
Oh, I'm sorry.
20,
No.
do the math.
Wait, Isaiah's got
66 minus 49 is
39.
27.
27.
Yeah, so there's 27 New Testament books. There should be 27 originals, right? Wrong. Because, and here's what the study of Oxyrhynchus, the 53 libraries, showed us, is that there were multiple copies of the originals. Especially if things were considered very, very important. Because back in the day, like imagine that, you're Luke and you're writing Paul's stuff, or whomever, like you're a scribe, and Paul or Peter or John is dictating to you, and you're responsible for writing his words. Do you think when he says, okay, I'm done, they would just roll up the scroll and send it off? No. So typically what would happen in this professional setting is that the scribe would write as he dictated, and then when he was done, Paul would read it, or someone would read it to him, because Paul was pretty much blind, and he would say, yep, that's exactly it. Or they would make corrections. And when they had a version that the author was happy with, they would make at least one more copy to keep for their own records. I mean, when you go, for example, you buy a house. Do you get a copy of the mortgage and the bank has a copy of the mortgage? Yeah, everyone's got a copy, and you got to sign the originals. It's the same thing. Like, honestly, textual scholarship has not changed in thousands of years. It hasn't changed. The tradition and the mechanics of scribal workness, I don't know what the word is. You know, this profession is literally unchanged. The means and the methods are different. But when things are important and you create an original, you create more than one original. And they better agree with each other. And so think about, particularly, and this is what they found in Oxyrhynchus, is that when something was very important and something was intended to be circulated, there were multiple originals made that went out into a wide geographic distribution, which all agreed with each other and all agreed with the original that was retained by the person. You guys remember 2 Timothy 4:11. Paul's getting ready to be crucified, not crucified, he's getting ready to be martyred in Rome. And in 2 Timothy 4:11 he says, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he's useful to me for ministry. And Tychicus I've sent to Ephesus. Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments. Now the word books is biblia. Bring the papyri. The word parchments, membrana, vellum, sheepskin. He said, bring my originals. So let's deal with the question I posed at the beginning. Which Bible translation is best? How many Bibles should you own? We talked about where the bias comes from. Are there differences in the source material? Yes. Are the material in the sense that you and I really need to be aware of them? Maybe. I think it just depends on how deeply you're studying and why. And eventually we'll deal with, what's the difference between reading your Bible and studying your Bible? Is there a difference? Should we do both? I believe so. Let me just give you some different layers of bias that affect us. Number one is selection bias, and that's my term. Which source material are you translating from? The second layer of bias is this new 18th century scholarship, which is heavily weighted towards the Alexandrian tradition, which tends to be influenced by Gnosticism, Greek heresy. Then there's the translation bias that we've talked about. And especially with translations where you have large committees with diverse backgrounds that don't agree on certain doctrinal positions. And you end up translating to the lowest common belief, the lowest common denominator. I had a conversation with Tim yesterday, and if you are interested in the preface to the LGV, he explains his translational approach. Right? If you want to know how he does it, he lays it all out in the preface. And basically his approach is this: look at all variant readings. But he does tend to prefer, as do I, the majority text and the Textus Receptus, because oldest does not mean best. One of the reasons why we might not have early copies of the Byzantine tradition from Antioch is because it's not as dry up there as it is in Oxyrhynchus in Cairo in Egypt. Things that got tossed in the dump, they rotted when you threw them out in Turkey and Syria. But when you did that in Egypt, not so much. So there's all kinds of counter arguments. For every argument that a minority text proponent has for why you shouldn't trust the majority text, there's a counter argument that says, well, here's the reason why that we should trust it. So having said that, there are some places in the minority text in the LGV where Tim does follow the minority reading. Because it's not just the source material where it comes from. How you translate into a modern language like English has to fit. The translation that you render has to fit your systematic theology. It has to fit what you already know to be true. Meaning, given two different varying readings of a source material, we go with the one that matches the truth as we understand it. And then this is one of the reasons why I think Textus Receptus was edited and had different versions like probably 15 times or more. Tim will tell you that the more he translates, the better he gets. And as he translates and learns and changes his opinion on some things, he has to go back and retranslate some other verses that he translated incorrectly because he translated it when he believed something else. Like, hey, we used to be Trinitarians. Right, here's a couple of examples of doctrines that affect translation bias. Immortality of the soul versus conditional immortality. Heavenly destiny versus earthly kingdom. Predestination versus free will. Trinitarianism versus biblical monotheism. Hypostatic union. Christ was fully God and fully man versus, hey, he was just a human. Dispensationalism, which believes that God has one plan, either has one plan for the Jews or is completely done with them and the church has replaced them, versus what we believe, which is we're grafted into the plan that God's working out with his people who was originally defined as the Jews that came out of Egypt and committed to him on Mount Sinai. That's one plan. People get grafted in or they fall away. There's no two different plans, but those things affect how you translate. So here's the question again. Which Bible translation is best? Let's deal with that one. Or let me say it this way. Given everything that I've gone through with you, would you rather spend more of your time reading King James, New King James, or an ESV, NIV, Living Translation? Which do you think you should use most in your Bible study and reading?
New King James.
Majority text.
I believe so.
New King James.
However, I also believe you need to own at least one copy of the others. And I like the readability of the English Standard Version. I really do. But I know that there are certain limitations. So if I'm sitting down just to read the Bible to be nourished, and I'm not worried about picking apart language and grammar and doctrine, I'm certainly going to go New King James over King James. Sorry, honey.
Why for thou does thou wish to do so?
But I also have absolutely no problem reading an NASB, or an NIV, or an ESV, or an RSV, or an ASV. I have no problem reading it. It just depends on what I'm doing and why. And even when I am doing my own version of textual criticism, I'm just a little teeny tiny baby. And Tim says he's only a little teeny tiny baby. He's like, listen, I don't have any of the training all these other guys do. But I know we wouldn't know the difference, right?
We're little cells.
So, I mean, even when I'm doing my own stuff, because I'm getting to the point where I'm telling you, it's not easy. I will read Tim's LGV, and there are places where I'm like, oh, really? I'm not sure I agree with that, and I'll go to the Greek, and I usually end up calling him and going like, why'd you do that? And sometimes I can figure out why without having to call him. Sometimes I need to call him and say like, I don't understand the grammar. What's going on with this? I think this, and he's like, no, you gotta know this. So it's just like it's a huge job. But for us, we need to understand the differences between the traditions, where the bias comes from, how it might potentially affect us, because we're all at the point where we can no longer just blindly read the Bible and just assume that the translators did a good job. We're way past that point. And I'm thankful that we've got Tim I'm thankful that I've got Tim that has shown me the error of that approach, because it's cleaned up my personal study habits tremendously. So let me say it one more time. I believe that you should, for your primary study and use something from the majority text, which means King James, New King James. New King James just easier reading. but I think you should own at least one other Bible that comes from the minority text version. And if you want something with easy readability, that is more literal and less on the right side of that spectrum, like tending towards like thought for thought or paraphrase, stick with something like the ESV or the New American Standard. They tend to be more literal translations, but they are coming from that minority text tradition, translated by people who are Trinitarians, blah, 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 blah.